Fundamentally, all takeoffs, approaches, and landings, whether to and from a carrier or a training field, are executed in the same manner. The purpose of this film is to teach those fundamentals. Your plane is in the takeoff position. You have advised your instructor by interphone, tail wheel locked, ready for takeoff. Look around and make sure there are no other aircraft that may be landing or taking off. Then, after a final visual check with the tower, you are ready to go. You release the brakes and put your heels firmly on the deck. You then advance the throttle smoothly but positively to the sea level stop. Meanwhile, holding the stick slightly back of the neutral position, which keeps the tail down and allows the locked tail wheel to assist in maintaining directional control. Pick an object on the horizon for a reference, and remember that engine torque will tend to pull the nose to the left as takeoff power is applied. Be quick to correct this and any other swerves. As your speed increases, maintain directional control with your rudders and ease the stick forward. This is the takeoff attitude and is held throughout the takeoff run. As you approach takeoff speed, maintain this takeoff attitude, exerting back pressure on the stick as necessary. And your plane will leave the ground. As soon as you are safely airborne and all obstacles are cleared, retard your manifold pressure to 30 inches and your propeller pitch to 1950 RPM. As your speed approaches normal climb, 95 knots, assume a normal climbing attitude, adjusting your trim tabs as necessary and climb straight ahead. At an altitude of approximately 100 feet, or when you have cleared the end of the runway, whichever comes first, depress the power push and bring up your wheels. When flaps are used on takeoffs, raise them at 200 feet above the terrain. At 250 feet, start your turn out of the field. When you have 1,000 feet of altitude, switch your gas selector valve from reserve to right tank, always remembering to turn through the left tank position and never through the off position. Here are the varying attitudes of your plane during a correct takeoff. Here is another takeoff run. Notice how the tail stays down and allows the locked tail wheel to help maintain directional control. As the speed increases, the nose lowers to a position between level flight and climbing attitude. Approaching takeoff speed, the angle of attack is increased and the plane leaves the ground. At approximately 100 feet, or beyond the end of the runway, the wheels are raised. Traffic permitting, at 250 feet altitude, the plane begins a climbing turn and the takeoff is complete. Before going into the approach, let's review briefly the standard field entry procedure. You join the 1,000-foot traffic pattern at an angle of less than 45 degrees and a speed of 120 knots. At position 1, you switch the gas valve to your best tank and apply at least 4 strokes to your waffle pump. At position 2, retard your throttle until the warning horn sounds, then depress power push and lower wheels. With your wheels locked, apply throttle to regulate your rate of descent. At approximately 800 feet and 95 knots, lower 20 degrees of flaps for a half-flap approach. Report landing checkoff list complete. Level off at 500 feet and 90 knots, and with no traffic interfering, cross over at 500 feet and 90 knots. At this point, a beam of the upwind end of the field, you begin your approach. You are at 500 feet, 90 knots, and wingtip distance from the field, with 20 degrees of flaps. Check your wheels down and locked, and report to your instructor by intercommunication system. Wheels down and locked. Immediately prior to reaching a position abeam of your intended landing point, retard your throttle to 15 inches and place your prop in full low pitch. At a point abeam of the intended point of landing, start a turn toward the landing line, trimming your plane for a power glide attitude, which will produce a speed of 80 knots. Gradually reducing power, plan your approach so as to intersect the landing line with approximately 150 feet of altitude, 75 knots airspeed, and 800 feet of straightaway, prior to reaching the desired landing spot in the first third of the runway. Make sure any obstacles at the end of the field are cleared by a safe margin. Then, reduce power further and finally close your throttle just prior to beginning your transition to a three-point attitude for landing. Here is how the maneuver will look to you. You are in straight and level flight on the downwind leg. Abeam the upwind end of the field at 500 feet altitude, 90 knots and 1850 RPM, you are at wingtip distance from the field. At this point, you advise your instructor, wheels down and locked. Maintain your wingtip distance from the runway throughout the downwind leg. Just before coming abeam of your intended point of landing, retard your throttle to 15 inches and put your prop in full low pitch. Abeam of the landing point, start your turn and trim the plane for a power glide attitude to produce a speed of 80 knots. Gradually reduce throttle so as to intersect your landing line at approximately 150 feet altitude, 75 knots, and 800 feet of straightaway from the point of intended landing. With any obstruction safely cleared, finally close your throttle just prior to starting the transition to landing. Watch this properly executed approach. Abeam your intended landing point, start a turn to intersect the landing line with 150 feet of altitude and 800 feet of straightaway. Here are the final stages of the approach, ending with the point at which the throttle is completely closed just prior to beginning the transition to a three-point attitude. This is the final position of your plane in its approach. The turn-in to the landing line is the most important phase of the approach. Done correctly, the plane is in good balanced flight, lined up with the center of the runway at the straightaway point. If the turn is too shallow or too late, you will overshoot your landing line and have to make a sharp right turn to line up with the center of the runway. Correspondingly, if your turn is too steep, you will be angling in toward the runway, and a steep left turn will be necessary to line up with the center of the runway. Remember also to take into account the strength of the wind. A strong wind requires a slower rate of throttle reduction and a slightly increased angle of bank to reach your 800-foot straightaway point with an altitude of 150 feet. When making your first approaches, throttle may be advanced to maintain safe flight if necessary. But with practice, you can correct the errors that necessitated such an increase in power. Beginning with this last attitude of the approach, which occurs with the plane at an altitude of about 30 feet, this altitude will vary with different planes and different wind conditions, you are ready to break your glide preparatory to landing. This is done by applying back pressure on the stick so that the nose raises slowly and smoothly and the plane comes to a three-point attitude a foot or two above the ground. Your aim is to maintain this attitude until the airplane lands, keeping it airborne as long as possible. This requires more and more backstick as the plane loses airspeed and settles to the runway. If you have done everything correctly, the stick will be all the way back as your plane contacts the runway in a three-point attitude. Keep it fully back until the plane stops rolling. Keep your heels on the deck until the plane touches down. Your landing is not complete until your plane has stopped. Use rudder and brakes to keep your plane rolling straight. Keep your stick all the way back to help maintain directional control by holding the tail and the lock tail wheel down. And always keep one hand on the throttle. Stay relaxed. Don't tense up. Here are some common errors. If you brake your glide too low, you will hit the wheels first and bounce. If you pull your stick back too rapidly when braking your glide, your plane will balloon or gain altitude. If there is any doubt in your mind, don't try to land. Advance throttle and go around again. Here is a way to help you judge your altitude. Instead of looking at the ground or the nose of your plane, let your vision pick up 3 points that will act as a guide. For example, the horizon, this building, and the edge of the runway. You will instinctively be able to judge more accurately your distance above the ground through the position of these 3 points in relation to your line of vision. Keep this landing attitude in your mind. Let your eyes pick up objects and reference points on the ground below, ahead, and around you to establish the position of your plane as this position in relation to those objects. And your landing and landing run-out will be as smooth as this one. Crosswind is determined by the direction in which the wind is blowing across the landing line in relation to the final approach heading. This is a right crosswind, and this is a left crosswind, regardless of the position of your plane in the approach pattern. Let's examine the effects of a crosswind and how to correct for it. An aircraft flying directly into or with the wind travels a straight path over the ground. In a crosswind, the plane while moving forward is pushed away from this path in the direction of the wind. This off-course motion is called drift. To correct for drift, you must turn into the wind enough to counteract this sideways motion. This will make the plane fly at such an angle as to counteract the drift. This is known as crabbing. The amount of crab necessary will depend upon the strength of the crosswind. In crosswind approaches and landings, the standard field entry procedure is used, and the pattern is identical to that of a 180-degree power approach to a touch-and-go landing. If it is a right crosswind blowing you away from the landing line, the bank of your approach turn is fairly shallow, and your power reduction is more gradual. If it is a left crosswind blowing you toward the landing line, your power reduction is more rapid and your approach turn more steeply banked to avoid being drifted past the landing line. Also remember that on the downwind leg, to avoid drift that forces you away from the landing line in a right crosswind and toward the landing line in a left crosswind, you must set up a crab by making a balanced turn into the wind and leveling your wings when you have achieved the desired track paralleling the landing line. When abeam the upwind end of the field, always check your landing gear and then report wheels down and locked. Seeing that a left crosswind is causing you to drift toward the field on the downwind leg, you make a balanced turn into the wind and set up a crab so that your track over the ground will parallel your landing line. Obviously, a crab to either port or starboard will affect your wingtip distance from the field, and you must now gauge your wingtip distance from the position where you estimate your left wingtip would be if you had not set up a crab. Also remember that once you have set up a crab, you are in balanced flight. As you make your approach turn, you reduce your power and adjust your bank according to the direction and velocity of the wind. In a strong left crosswind, such as this that is blowing you toward the landing line, your power reduction is faster. And your bank in the latter part of your approach turn will be fairly steep. If a strong right crosswind is encountered, your throttle reduction would be slower and your turn more shallow. Continuing in for your landing, you are in level flight in the straightaway. Notice the amount of drift, in this case from left to right, of your plane over the runway. To counteract this drift, lower your upwind wing, in this case your left wing, while holding enough opposite rudder to stop your nose from turning toward the low wing. Maintain this wing down correction and slowly bring your nose up for a full stall landing. As the landing occurs, your wings will automatically come to a level position. During your landing run-out, keep the stick full back and into the wind, keeping your tail down and achieving maximum efficiency from the locked tail wheel. Be particularly alert to notice any tendency of the nose to swerve and immediately make the necessary correction. Here is how a crosswind landing with correction for drift should look. Coming in for a landing in a strong left crosswind, the plane is in level flight in the straightaway. As it begins drifting across the runway, the upwind wing is lowered and opposite rudder held to keep its path straight. Making a full stall landing, its wings level off, and with the stick full back and into the wind, the plane begins its run-out. With your landing run-out under control, take off again, still holding the stick into the wind and using rudder pressure to avoid weathercocking and maintain a straight heading as you advance throttle. As your takeoff speed increases, you gradually ease off pressure on left rudder, still keeping the stick into the wind and maintaining a wing-level straight path down the runway. As the plane leaves the ground, it will begin to drift to the right. To compensate for this drift, set up a crab by making a gentle, balanced turn into the wind, thus maintaining a straight path over the ground. Don't use excessive rudder in the turn, which would dangerously reduce performance at this critical time. With the drift corrected, continue making a normal wing-level climb out of the field. To review, if it is a right crosswind blowing you away from the landing line, the bank of your approach turn is fairly shallow,
and your power reduction is more gradual. If it is a left crosswind blowing you toward the landing line, your power reduction is more rapid, and your approach turn more steeply banked to avoid being drifted past the landing line. To follow a straight path over the ground in a crosswind condition, set up a crab by making a balanced turn into the wind, then leveling your wings when you have achieved your desired track. In landing, to counteract your drift across the runway, lower your upwind wing while holding enough opposite rudder to stop your nose from turning toward the low wing. Keep your stick full back and into the wind during your landing rollout. When you are airborne after takeoff, compensate for your drift by making a gentle, balanced turn into the wind, thus setting up a crab which is maintained as you continue your climb out of the field.
The procedure for getting into a small field is actually a continuation of your high-altitude emergency that will bring you into a safe landing. However, in the high-altitude emergency, you glided down through checkpoints every 1,000 feet in planning your approach until you reach the number 1 position. Actually, at an altitude of 1,000 feet, you can get into the field either from this position or from position number 2, which is on the landing line directly downwind from the field. Also, in practicing the entry to small fields, you start with power on and enter the circular traffic pattern at an altitude of 1,000 feet with an airspeed of 120 knots and 1,850 RPM with your gas on the best tank for landing. Entry is made at an angle of 45 degrees or less, and the point of intended landing is kept at wingtip distance. The pattern may be entered at any point, but you must pass through the number 1 position before taking your first small field shot. If entry is made beyond the number 1 position, you must circle the field before making a shot at it with closed throttle. If the throttle is closed at the number 1 position, immediately place the prop in full low pitch. Depress the power push and drop your wheels. Trim your plane to a 95-knot glide in balanced flight. When the warning horn stops, check your landing gear down and report an ICS, wheels down and locked. In the straightaway, when you are in a position to reach the desired landing spot in the first third of the field, apply full flaps and adjust your gliding speed to 80 knots. Maintain this attitude until you break your glide for landing. Always take into consideration the effect of the wind force on your flight path during the approach. Under strong wind conditions, which tend to delay your approach, you must make a steeper turn and a minimum amount of crosswind gliding. Conversely, in a light or no wind condition, your altitude must be dissipated by a shallower turn and a maximum of crosswind gliding. You may even have to cross the landing line and return to it in the case of the number 1 shot. If your throttle is closed at the number 2 position, you go through the same procedure. Prop in low pitch, depress power push, landing gear down, trim for a 95-knot glide, and report wheels down and locked when horn stops blowing. Judging your wind, make an S turn back to but not across your landing line. In the straightaway, full flaps are lowered and an 80-knot glide established and maintained until breaking the glide for landing. From the number 2 position also, you must take into account the effect of the prevailing wind condition. In a strong wind, your initial turn is steeper, with a minimum of crosswind gliding. In light or no wind, your initial turn is shallower, with a maximum crosswind glide. Plan your approach from either position so that flaps will be lowered in the straightaway, rather than in your approach turn. The length of your straightaway will vary depending on the type of your approach. However, flaps should be down and an 80-knot glide established with a minimum of 800 feet straightaway and 150 feet altitude from the point of intended landing. Here is a properly executed approach from the number 1 position under normal wind conditions. A 95-knot glide is established. Wheels lowered and locked. The turn into the landing line is made. Full flaps are lowered and the glide adjusted to 80 knots in the straightaway, and the plane goes in for a landing. Remember that in strong wind conditions, your turn would be steeper with a minimum of crosswind gliding. In a no-wind condition, your turn is shallower with a maximum of crosswind gliding. Let's look at it from your viewpoint. You're circling the field at wingtip distance, 1,000 feet altitude at 120 knots. You are approaching the number 1 position. Your instructor closes the throttle. Instinctively, you follow this procedure. You check your instrument panel. Place your prop in low pitch, full increase RPM. Depress the power push. Place the landing gear lever in the down position and trim your plane to maintain a glide of 95 knots in balanced flight. When your warning horn stops blowing, you check your landing gear down and report on your ICS, wheels down and locked. Having established that it's a normal wind, you make a turn in toward the landing line. When it is apparent that you are in position to land in the first third of the field, lower full flaps and adjust your gliding speed to 80 knots. Maintain this attitude, making sure that you clear any obstructions to the entrance to the field by a safe margin. And come in for a full stall landing. Now you are approaching the number 2 position at wingtip distance and with a no wind condition. Abeam the end of the field, your throttle is closed. Put the prop in low pitch. Depress power push. Lower your wheel. And trim your plane to maintain a glide of 95 knots in balanced flight. With a strong wind condition, you would start a shallow turn back to the landing line here. In a normal wind, you would start it here. But in the no wind condition availing today, you wait until you are here, dissipating your altitude on your crosswind glide in a steeply banked turn back to the landing line, and in your return crosswind glide. After joining the landing line, you lower your flaps and adjust your glide to 80 knots, then go in for your landing. Following your landing, and when the landing run is under control, apply full throttle and take off again. When you are safely airborne and clear of all obstructions, throttle back to 30 inches manifold pressure and adjust the prop to 1950 RPM. At 100 feet, raise your wheels, and at 200, if there are no high obstructions, raise your flaps. To maintain altitude as you raise your flaps, hold the nose attitude you had for 75 knots with full flaps. As your speed increases to 95 knots, trim the plane for normal climbing attitude and, traffic permitting, begin a climbing turn at 250 feet. Continue your climbing turn to join the circular traffic pattern at 1,000 feet and at wingtip distance. Ease your nose down to cruising attitude. At 120 knots, throttle back to 23 to 25 inches manifold pressure and adjust your prop to 1850 RPM. Here is how this maneuver to rejoin the 1,000-foot traffic circle looks. Starting your turn out of the field at 250 feet, you make a gradual climbing turn to the left so as to join the 1,000-foot traffic circle at a wingtip distance to your landing line, making sure you are clear of any traffic already in the circle. You then continue on toward position number 1. Or if you wish to leave the circle, break away to the right, again at an angle of less than 45 degrees. Intended to impress on your mind the procedures you should follow instinctively in the event of an emergency at either high or low altitude. The high altitude emergency begins when your instructor closes your throttle. The first and most important thing to do is to establish a normal gliding attitude, which gives you an airspeed of 95 knots. Maintain this attitude. Don't try to dive off excess altitude to get into a nearby field. Holding your established glide, switch your gas selector valve to the other tank and operate your wobble pump. Check the area ahead and around you for a field within gliding distance. The plane you are now in can glide approximately 1 mile for every 1,000-foot loss of altitude when in proper gliding attitude. With a field selected, such as this on your left, determine the wind direction by smoke movement or water streaks, and plan your approach to the upwind of the field when you are at 3,000 feet. Place your prop in low pitch. Adjust your trim tabs for normal glide attitude, and open your canopy. Make a thorough and systematic check of your instruments in an effort to determine the cause of the emergency. But remember, the first consideration is to make a proper approach and safe landing, which requires that your attention be primarily concentrated outside the cockpit. Watch your altimeter, and during this simulated emergency, which started at 6,000 feet, clear your engine by a momentary application of throttle once in every 1,000 feet of descent to assure yourself that power will be available when needed. Try to plan your approach so that when you are at a 45-degree angle from your landing point, the number 1 position, you will be between 1,200 and 1,500 feet and ready to begin your landing approach. Look at it this way. Your throttle was closed and the emergency began at 6,000 feet.
You selected a field, and at 5,000 feet were a beam of its downwind end, directly above the landing line. Flying a circle about the field, you were at 4,000 feet, a beam of the middle of the upwind leg. At 3,000 feet, upwind of the runway. At 2,000 feet, a beam of the center of the field on the downwind leg. And at approximately 1,200 to 1,500 feet, at the number 1 position, 45 degrees from your intended landing point. If you are not exactly at the proper altitude at your checkpoints, you may alter your pattern. Suppose you're at 5,500 feet here at the 5,000-foot checkpoint. Simply widen your circle by shallowing your bank, and at 4,000 feet you'll be where you belong. Or if you are at 3,500 feet here at the 4,000-foot checkpoint, steepen your bank and shorten your arc, and you'll be in the right position at the 3,000-foot point. The 3,000-foot and the 2,000-foot checkpoints are the most important. Try to hit the 2,000-foot point on the nose. From the number 1 position in a normal glide at 95 knots, the angle of bank and steepness of your turn to intersect the landing line will vary with the wind condition. In a strong wind, your turn must be steeper. In no wind, you may have to cross the landing line and make an S turn to return to it to give yourself 150 feet of altitude with 800 feet of straightaway. Unless the field is unsuitable, when you are sure you can reach the desired landing spot, lower your wheels, apply full flaps, and adjust your gliding speed to 80 knots, which you will maintain until you break your glide for the landing. Here is how it should look to you. At 4,000 feet, you are a beam of the center of the field headed upwind. At 3,000 feet, a beam of the upwind end. At 2,000 feet, a beam of the middle of the field headed downwind. And at position number 1, you're at 1,500 to 1,200 feet. The completion of your landing approach, if properly executed, should appear like this. You judge the strength of the wind, which in this case is moderate, and intersect your landing line at a point which will give you 150 feet of altitude with 800 feet of straightaway, from which point a successful landing can be made. In a low altitude emergency, simulated or actual, you must act instantly. The emergency usually begins after a takeoff. Never try to get back to your field. Remember, never try to get back to the field from which you just took off. You must learn to instinctively put the nose down and establish a gliding attitude. Then look for the best possible place to land. Say your engine cut out here as you are starting a climbing turn. Immediately establish a glide. Raise your wheels and look for a place to land. To you, it might appear like this. You've just become airborne after a touch-and-go landing. You started your turn and are in a climbing attitude when your engine cuts out. You immediately put your stick forward with a positive movement and establish a normal gliding attitude. You depress the power push and raise your landing gear. Then set your propeller in full low pitch. Then you select a spot for landing that you can reach. Don't try to stretch your glide or make a steep turn, and you go in for your landing using flaps when necessary. If you can find no suitable spot, make a full stall landing into the wind. Never try to stretch your glide as this man did. Never try to turn back to the field from which you took off, as this man did. Always land straight ahead or at a very slight angle. And if no landing spot is available, make a full stall landing into the wind. And your landing will probably be one such as this, from which you can walk away.